Hi, I'm Jamie. This is Dead Dodge Garage, and this is still a ridiculous 440 build. In the last episode, I covered the trials and tribulations of getting to this point with our shiny new KB pistons installed and our roller camshaft in place. Today, I'm going to try and verify that our end play for that thing is right now that the timing cover is finally bolted to the engine, and then we'll move on from there. The overarching theme of the last video was new parts are stupid, and I fully stand by that. Take this AR Engineering timing cover, for example. Very nice piece, but it requires special ARP bolts, which we finally have. These bolts came with washers that don't fit, because these bolts have to be set into the cover, so I had to omit those. The washers on the bigger bolts did fit, thankfully. So this thing is now secured to the engine, and we can take our camshaft thrust measurement. Now, I showed our shiny new roller camshaft in the last video, and I also showed the cam card, but I never did mention this is a Hughes part. Again, it seems to be very nicely machined. Anyway, now I'm trying to verify the final installation of this roller cam before I can move on. With the timing cover bolted tightly in place with the gasket behind it and the special cap thingy they give us with an opening in it, I've got the mag-based dial indicator rigged up to show us how far that thing will move forward. Watch the dial face as I pull it up with my finger. It's just about 5 thousandths, maybe a skosh under. Now the spec, according to the sheet that comes with this timing cover and button kit, should be 5 to 10 thousandths, so we are a little too tight. To increase the amount of thrust here, what I have to do is take this outer spacer section out and then carefully grind it. I could sand it, but because it's heat treated, grinding is the preferred method to take off a little bit of meat. I seem to recall installing a different type of cam button in the other engine. I think it had a stack of shims in here. This one only has one washer type shim on each side of this bearing, and I think they both need to be there. Nice, nice. Apparently that quick trip to the bench grinder was good for 1/1000 and a half. I'm happy with that. With the measuring complete, it's time to remove the special windowed cover and install the permanent one. So shiny. Note, it's held on here with 5 obnoxious torque screws, and it's sealed with 2 O-rings. Yay! It's only just occurred to me this engine is going to get painted at some point, and now we're going to have to mask this ridiculously fancy timing cover. Now we could just paint it orange, but you spend that kind of money on a shiny piece, you want to see it shiny. Well, okay, we're definitely painting these shiny aluminum stealth cylinder heads though. Speaking of which, with the roller cam thrust solved, it's now time to get into some more intense science. As discussed in the previous video, these pistons actually stick somewhat out of the hole, and we've got closed chamber cylinder heads. Now, I've already worked out the head gasket thickness required to get safe clearance there, and I'm satisfied that we have that. What I don't know is what our compression ratio is going to work out to be. So today, for the first time ever, I'm going to CC the top of this piston, the valve reliefs, and the chamber of our stealth cylinder head, and then we're going to do some math. Baby's first CC rig here is a cutout section of like a sandwich box pulled out of a garbage can with a hole in it, and a random graduated syringe I found in the shop, which seems to maybe kind of sort of work. Now there's a special fluid that can be used for this, but I don't have any of that, so I'm using engine oil. I've filled this graduated syringe to 30 cc's, and now I'm going to start filling this thing, and when it's brimmed, we'll record where it ends up. Notice I sealed around those reliefs with some grease. It worked pretty well, but I did have to lift it at that left corner so some air could escape. There are a couple of residual bubbles, and there's a little bit of oil on top of the thing as a result of filling it from there, but I'm satisfied with that mostly. We're down to about 22 and a half cc's. Nah, that's a solid 22. That means we put 8 cc's of oil in there, which funny enough is exactly what I guessed. Obviously on this one, the piston side of the equation was super easy because I just had to CC those valve reliefs. If you had a domed piston, you'd have to do what's called a downfill. If it sticks above the deck, you've got to send it down a good ways, measure that, account for that in your measurements, and then fill the entire thing up to the top and measure that. To calculate our compression ratio, there are a couple more numbers we're going to need. One of those is our combustion chamber volume, and to get that, it's time to now look at our shiny new cylinder heads. These again are the 440 source aluminum stealth heads. The great thing about these is they're designed specifically to look like a factory head, and once they're painted up, you'd never know that they're there. There are some obvious differences that you can spot if you know these heads well, but overall, it's a nice look. Do note, these require a special cylinder head bolt. The factory bolts will not fit in these little dimple thingies. The exhaust hardware is pre-helicoiled. Unlike factory heads, these holes don't go into water, so there's no possibility of leakage there, like you get if you helicoil a factory head. We had these heads checked by our favorite local machine shop, Johnson Machine. They swapped out the springs for the proper ones for our roller cam, checked the seats, as you can tell by the markings there, and just generally made sure these were ready to run. Here's the business end of the Stealth cylinder head. Note, obviously this is a closed chamber design. It's kind of, sort of, almost heart-shaped, and then it has a quench pad right here. Here's the underside of our original 1967 915 casting number heads. Note the chambers are similar. They actually appear a little bit smaller from side to side there, but a little bit deeper, to my eye anyway. The valve sizes are apparently 2.14 intake, 1.81 exhaust. And notice, because this is an aluminum head, it has seat inserts for the intake and exhaust valves. There's 50 cc's in. I've got another 50 in the chamber, and we'll fill it up carefully. Okay, and now I've got it totally full. Notice my little shield didn't fully block the cylinder, and we did lose a tiny little bit at the end there. I got a large air pocket out here. There are a couple little bubbles, but I'm pretty satisfied we've got a usable number. I stopped with a sizable air pocket in there still, and we were at 78 cc's. I then fully brimmed it, and again, as you can see, it spilled out a little bit. We ended up at 85 cc's. In fact, maybe more like 86 cc's. But again, with that little bit of leakage, I'm thinking the magic number is 83, maybe even 84 cc's. That's where this chamber is going to be at. You ever put off learning something for, I don't know, 10 or 15 years because you think it's going to be hard, and then you find out it's totally not, and it takes 5 minutes? That's me and this. Oh, important note, make sure you install a spark plug. Otherwise, a mess is going to happen. Now, 440 Source advertised these heads as having approximately an 80 cc chamber, and honestly, that number was probably close enough for our purposes. They do say in big bold letters with an asterisk that 80 cc is a nominal figure, and you should really check it yourself. If you're trying to go through this same process with a factory head, their tolerances were terrible, and just about every factory cylinder head has been milled once or twice by this point in history anyway, so that's when CECing comes in handy, because you'll know exactly what you've got. Now there's a big, crazy, complicated formula you can use to calculate your compression. I don't happen to know that formula, but Summit Racing's compression calculator tool does. I'm sure there are others out there on the web as well, but I'm going to use Summit's. I know most of these numbers already. Our bore size, being a 40 thou oversized 440, is 4.36. We've got a stock stroke of 3.75 inches. We just calculated our dish measurement, which in this case is just the cc we got in those valve reliefs, 8 cc's. We know our head gasket thickness compressed will be 0.051 inches. We get that number from 440 Source, and we're going to go ahead and take that as a fact. And our chamber cc, I measured 84 as you saw, but we'll double check this calculation with a slightly smaller number as well, just in case. The only thing I don't yet know precisely is our piston to deck clearance. Now there are certainly different ways of getting this measurement. One would be to use a deck bridge, but I don't have one of those. The other is done with this magnetic base dial indicator, which I use for so many other things. Essentially, you zero it on the deck, then you lift the needle and carefully swing it over the piston, then set it down. I've got a measurement of 5 thousandths there. Punching in these numbers, the Magic Summit Racing compression calculator gives us 10.94 to 1, which is a lot. And just to be on the safe side, in case I was a little sloppy in my chamber measurement there, I punched in 80 cc's. That would raise it to 11.4 to 1. That is even more. I made a mild tactical error entering numbers here. This math is totally wrong. We'll get back to that in a second. If that sounds like a lot of compression to you, well, it should, because it is. It's sort of generally accepted that running premium 91 octane fuel, you really shouldn't exceed more than like 10.5 to 1. In fact, even a good bit lower than that is considered safe. But there are some other things we need to consider here. What I've just calculated here is our static compression. As you can see, it takes into account the chamber specifications and the size of our cylinders. But what it doesn't do is take into account what's happening with the valves. Valve timing events in your engine actually contribute significantly to the amount of effective compression your engine will see. This number is called dynamic compression because it takes all of these dynamic events into account. Valve timing events are obviously controlled by our camshaft grind. The important thing we need to know is the closing point of the intake valve to make this calculation. And that closing point is controlled by the duration of our camshaft lobe. So we're going to make a measurement here to figure out where that valve closes. I've carefully, repeatably found a measurement here, which is 104 degrees after bottom dead center. That is the number we need to plug into a calculator and find our dynamic ratio. The other number we need is rod length, which is 6.76 inches in a stock 440 like this one. But hold the phone. Before we calculate our dynamic compression, I need to tell you something. I did a boo-boo. These numbers are wrong. Notice here I wrote down 005, that's 5 thousandths. Well, when I punched these numbers into the online calculator, allegedly I moved the decimal point on our deck clearance and I punched in 0.05. That's very wrong. That would put the top of our piston like here. That pretty much solves this whole deal, because if I was right in measuring the chamber at 84 cc, the compression ratio is going to be 9.86 to 1. And if I was wrong, and this actually is closer to 80 as they specify, well, we'd have 10.22 to 1. Either of those numbers is safe on 91 octane premium fuel with iron heads. And with our aluminum heads, oh, we're very, very safe. So, given that new important information, our rod length and our valve closing point, which is 104 degrees after bottom dead center, our dynamic compression ratio is actually 4.95 to 1. Oh, it keeps getting better because I didn't have the degree wheel set quite right, and this is actually this, and this is actually this. Listen, the point is, we're definitely safe. This number, which is, actually, let's just say something like 5 for simplicity, is certainly in the realm of safety as far as dynamic compression ratios go. That number may sound very low to you. Your dynamic ratio is almost always going to be much lower than your static. And I was seeing safe numbers with aluminum heads of something like 8.75 to 1. Essentially what that means is we could run a way more aggressive cam, get way more cylinder filling, and still be safe. Oh, there's so many lessons here. Learning is hard, math is hard, trying to explain something while you're learning it is very difficult, and doing math on camera is like impossible. Everybody knows that. So to make a long story short, you should probably always check this, but if I hadn't checked it in this case, everything would have been fine. It's basically 10 to 1, and we can move on. So I decided to put the math nightmare behind me and proceed with assembling this engine. The next logical step before rolling it upside down to finish the oil pan and pickup and everything was installing the harmonic balancer. So I went and dug that out, cleaned some blasting sand off it, and installed it with the requisite tool. Unfortunately, because this engine is this engine and absolutely nothing has been simple or straightforward or worked how it's supposed to on this dang thing, the harmonic balancer fitment is wrong. The snout of the crank should be below this face of the balancer, such that when you install the bolt with the washer clamps down on the balancer and holds it tight in against the timing gear onto the crank. As you know, if you've been following my exploits for a while, I have assembled a lot of Chrysler engines. I have installed a lot of Chrysler harmonic balancers, and each one of them has had this configuration. The balancer should sit up above the snout of the crankshaft. An easy way to tell that is by looking at these washers. You see the contact patch outside for the balancer, and the shiny spot in the middle where it does not contact the crank. It's also very common to see these washers concave because as you torque the bolt down, it'll pull the center of the washer in and it'll end up kind of dished. So imagine my utter confusion when I noticed this. The surface of the balancer is like right perfectly in line with the surface of the crank. I thought about trying to measure the difference between the two, but instead of trying to rig up the mic on here, I decided to mark this with a dry erase marker, which I just wiped off, that's my bad. And I also marked the washer. I started the bolt in the threads to center these pieces. Whoop, come on. Well, it was easier to do off camera. Anyway, and then I scrubbed it like this, went around several times, and then took the bolt and washer back off. Note, the marker on the balancer was never touched. In fact, the only place this is contacting anything is this outer ridge on the crankshaft. I looked around the shop to find a random big block to pull the balancer bolt out of so you can see what this relationship should look like. This is a 1970 440 HP, so it actually does have the heavy-duty rods and the big external weight on the balancer, but the balancer fitment itself is the same, and you can see the crank is sitting below the balancer face. It's not a big difference, it's only a couple thousandths maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3, but that's enough for the washer to seat on the balancer and hold it tight. If I were to have ignored the fitment here and just torqued the bolt down, it would not actually be holding the balancer tight in any way. The washer would not be clamping that, and the only thing keeping it in place would be this woodruff key. There are harmonic balancers in the world that are simply held in place with the press fit between the crank snout and the inside of the balancer. But I don't want to trust that, especially on this engine where we're going to have a good few horse ponies, and we're also going to have a big crazy serpentine belt drive attached to the front. Speaking of that serpentine drive, this balancer being further back than it's supposed to be will probably mess up the alignment of the belt, if it was ever right to begin with. Now, the factor that determines the depth of the harmonic balancer is the thickness of the crankshaft gear for the timing chain. You can see it bottoms out against this shoulder on the crank. Well, the balancer comes in and sandwiches that gear and holds it tight. Oh, yeah, if the balancer out here ever moves, this is also no longer pressed in place, especially if it's just a loose fit like this. Some of them are more of a press. And this could start wobbling on the Woodruff key. Also not good. So I can only surmise that our new crankshaft gear, this fancy aftermarket type, is a little bit shorter than the factory one, moving the balancer inward and creating this issue. I compared the depth of this hole to this surface to our Hemi crank and to a 3D3 crank for an upcoming build, and they were essentially exactly the same. So I think it's got to be the crank gear issue. So now I'm pulling the balancer back off. Thankfully, because I greased the surface in there, it moves pretty easily. Even so, there are a few things I hate more in life than redoing things for what seems like no good reason. Anyway, with the balancer off, we can discuss our options here. There aren't many. Option 1 would be finding a shim that perfectly fits this crankshaft and has a little slot for the Woodruff key. That could bring the balancer out and solve this fitment issue. I don't think that's going to be an option here. If those do exist, well, I don't have one under this roof right now. The other solution I came up with, which I can do right now, is file the snout of the crank. So I started filing after putting a little bib around this thing to hopefully prevent material intrusion. And look at this. The file is only hitting that ridge on the outside of the crank snout because it's not flat. I really don't know how hard I need to go here, but I'm just going to try and get all of those shadows gone. So this is a nice, flat, smooth surface. Oh, my arm's tired. Hopefully that's good enough. Obviously, grinding would be much faster, but I really don't want to kick up a bunch of horrible metallic dust, that'll land in our new engine. Or that new engine, that would be bad. Well, it's hard to tell, but that feels like it might have done it. Gonna remark it and do the washer check again. Nope. Wipe the marker right off there. It might have sort of contacted some of the balancer. This is gonna take a lot. As I've mentioned, I have never seen this before. This is a wacky problem, and I wouldn't expect anyone out there to run into it again. It could happen, but I guess the great takeaway here is, as you're assembling an engine, pay attention, because stupid little details like this can ruin your day. Now, I do want to point something else out here. There actually seems to be a raised edge toward the outside of the harmonic balancer bolt washer. It's really hard to detect too, but I can kind of feel it and I can kind of see it. The one I took off that other 440 had a more prominent line as well. I grabbed a different washer. This is a used one, and it's not in amazing shape, but you can see it's got more of that ridge at the outside I was talking about, so I thought this might help. It also has a horrible ding out of it here, so I did some file work just to see if this would solve our problem. And it doesn't. It's slightly better. Note, the pattern is different now. It was contacting toward the middle, but not at the outside of the snout. For science, I did grab another big block balancer and check the depth. They're exactly the same, so it's definitely not that. For the second round of filing, I broke out the bastard file and ripped off some big boy chips. If that doesn't move the needle, I'm gonna lose my mind. I just wanna go home to my family. Tell you what, I'm getting real good at working this balancer tool. That looks good. Big money. Okay, we're almost good. I marked it in 4 places on the crank snout and on the balancer. I also drew our same line across the washer. Note, it did slightly contact in the middle, and note 1 mark is gone from the crank snout. That's because my file job isn't perfectly level. I'll take another stab at this, and I think we'll be golden. But that'll be I want to say, week from now, Jamie problem? For various strategic reasons, it's suddenly like a month later, and this 440 has not magically finished itself. I still need to finish filing the snout of the crank there so I can get the balancer fitted permanently. And then I'd like to at least get this thing to the point of a long block. Ideally a dressed long block ready to go on our run stand, but we'll see. Filed again, with any luck, for the last time. Now, I'm sure I've already mentioned that this is dumb and hopefully you won't run into it, but I have learned since discovering this issue, it's not actually unprecedented. I was able to find commercially available harmonic balancer shims. Not for the big block Chrysler, but for the big block Chevrolet. They might exist for the Chrysler engine, but I'd have no idea where to find them. Fixed forever. Oh, go in your home. Come on. Torqued! So now I can finally wrap up this bottom end stuff. That operation starts with the rear main seal cap. Apparently the last person that installed this was a fan of the completely coat the sides of it in silicone technique. Also, at some point, it seems to have had shellac on it. They even siliconed behind the rear main seal. You know, I get the feeling there might have been a leaking issue. I'm definitely not the cover the rear main seal half and everything else here in silicone guy. I just dropped it in like normal with the lip facing inward and then siliconed the ends of the seal and the little ends of this thing where they come down and meet the block. Now I've got to install the side seals. Unlike the old school ones, which are like fiber, these are some kind of rubber. I think they have reinforcing metal in there. I don't know. Anyway, my technique is always to install them kind of like this. So then as I'm dropping the cap in there, they'll gradually slide into position here. I always start these bolts a little bit before the cap goes all the way home, just to make sure everything's aligned. I did notice once it was in place, these are a little below flush. I know they bottomed out down there, so I don't know if maybe this time the cap like compressed them a little bit as it went down. I'm gonna hit it with some silicone here and hopefully that's fine. Now, just like our 426 Hemi project over here, we've got a reproduction 7-quart oil pan for this engine. I've got the pickup installed under there, and I dropped the pan on for a test fit. I've explained the process for that many times, but basically, you want the pickup to like just touch the pan so when your gasket comes in, you get your tiny little gap. On this engine, instead of using the factory tray and double gasket situation, we're using one of these fancy Moroso Milodon one-piece windage tray / O-ring type gasket assemblies, which is nice. I made sure the pickup just touched and left us a little gap like that. And this plastic gasket, being about that tall, should work out perfectly. Clean the shipping oil and the random chunks off of and out of the oil pan, and it's ready to install now. I do still need to get silicone in these voids and on the corners up there with the timing cover. But I wanted to show you this. The bolt holes in our aftermarket tray gasket thingy, let's say they're not perfect. I've got it shifted this way a little bit. They're not quite centered. And yet, up here, it looks like we need to shift it that way more. I don't even know if I'm going to be able to start all the bolts. Here's some more aftermarket parts or super fun stuff. Our fancy billet timing cover is shaped differently than the factory one. It doesn't fill in this corner here. I actually trimmed the gasket because it was sticking out and that looked funny. Got to thinking about it and looked. That O-ring, the outer one, does not touch in the corner. So we've only got one there. That's fine, it's the same deal at the back. That outer ring does not touch the oil pan at all. For a second there, I was thinking the bolt hole thing might be the timing cover's fault. And maybe it is partially, but these do not line up either. These are the furthest forward ones I can even start bolts. There's no adjustment here, essentially. So that just doesn't work. We actually have a second one of these on the shelf. I grabbed it. It looked worse. I did get these bolts in. But yeah, those are just totally wrong. This lines up perfectly with the regular Felpro gasket. So it's that stupid thing. Interesting, that's actually a Mr. Gasket brand part. Why Mr. Gasket? Why? It even says made in USA right on it. Recall, if you will, this thing had a factory windage tray when I took it apart. That and the oil pan got completely mangled because they were like cemented together and would not come off of the block. That and the additional oil capacity are why we went with this reproduction 7-quart pan. And that one-piece tray and gasket were supposed to make this a quick and easy install. But no. Cast your mind back to when I disassembled this engine and found that it was full of sand. We learned after that this engine was sandblasted to change the color from blue to orange. They did a fairly thorough job. They even sandblasted the heads of these bolts in place. Anyway, I've got the oil pump on now. I did open it and look at it and add some extra oil, although it shipped with some in there. I did also install the requisite O-ring and the flat gasket behind it. You know, I'm thinking about this now because when I spec'd this standard volume pump, I thought we were running a super mild cam and this engine was never going to do anything crazy. It still might not do anything crazy, but it now has aluminum heads and a roller cam and pretty aggressive springs and a stick transmission behind it. I'm thinking maybe upgrading to the high volume pump's a good idea, but of course I don't have one on hand. I don't like this project. I didn't like it when I started it, and I sure don't like it now. Nothing just works. Nothing just fits, or bolts onto this engine, or goes the way it ought to go. And I don't know why. Maybe it's my fault, but I like to think it isn't. It's the next day, and I think I've solved this problem by removing the little steel inserts from the front two and the rear two bolt holes. I should be able to kind of sort of average it between front and back and make it work now, I hope. I borrowed a high volume oil pump from another project. We're ordering a replacement for that. And I got that swapped on here. I feel a whole lot better about it knowing what this engine is going to be capable of. And look at that. It's right side up with an oil pan and a pump and a balancer and all kinds of things. And now it's finally time to assemble the top end of this engine. Before the cylinder heads go on, I'd like to get these roller lifters installed. Now these are a Morel conversion lifter. It's a pair of roller lifters connected by a bar. That's pretty typical these days. There are different companies that make these, but these ones are that. The first step is wiping off the fibrous stuff that is gathered on there from sitting around in this box. The next step is to soak these things in oil, at least the roller sections. The idea there is to get a healthy amount of oil into these rollers. The little needle bearings in there will thank us for that. I'm not going to soak these for a day or anything, but I am going to let them hang out in the little oil spa I made out of half of a quart of driven break-in oil and a broken pot for like 5 to 10 minutes. Unlike the break-in oil I put in Mark's 318 recently, which was a glorious bluish greenish color, this stuff is just normal oil color. Nice. And there we've got all 8 lifter pairs installed. They're all moving very nicely. So I'm pleased with that. Now I've seen people in the past install these conversion type roller lifters with the link bars this way. I've seen people clearance blocks and stuff to make that work. I don't know why. I don't know if there's specific brands that tell you to do that. I called my friend Just Mopar Joe, who of course does cool big block stuff like this all the time, and he said, no, they go that way, the easy way. So that's what I've done here. And now it's finally time to install our shiny new cylinder heads, which are in those boxes over there right now. The first step to that, of course, cleaning the deck surface carefully. Then I grabbed one of our shiny new 440 source head gaskets. I know I've mentioned this is what we're going to be using. This is what it looks like. These are coated, much like the Felpros are coated, but these are like sticky. I don't know what that is. In many regards, it looks a lot like a later Chrysler factory head gasket, but it's black. These big block gaskets use these slits here. Those restrict coolant flow somewhat, and they account for different coolant port positions. These also match the factory gasket, and you can tell that by the corrosion in those slit areas. You know, there are a lot of things to like about these 440 source heads. The biggest thing, the lightweight. I cleaned the head gasket surface, all of the other sealing surfaces, and I got some little random chunks out of here. Now I've got the first head dropped on. I need to get bolts in. I kind of thought these were ARPs, but it turns out they're cheap ARP knockoffs. It says alloy FMI on the head, but it has the same 12 point, and it even has the same kind of tapered area underneath the bolt head right there. You can see that. Here are the washers included. They are not as fancy as real ARPs, and they don't have the little indent in the middle there to account for the bolt head. And what that means is some of them don't sit flat. This one kind of sort of seems to, but one of the other ones did not. Anyway, I don't have much choice but to install these. I am going to oil the heads and the washers here, and I'll also get some oil on the threads. Boop. I am oiling all of these bolts, but they actually came out of the packages pretty oily, so at least there's that. And just like that, it's got 2 heads and a full complement of head bolts, which I even snugged down with my speed wrench. Now they get torqued to the factory spec of 70 pound-feet. If they were ARP bolts, I would have used ARP lube to lubricate them, and I would be using ARP's torque specs. Man, big blocks have a lot of head bolts. That's one thing that makes them superior to small blocks. With that out of the way, it's time for the next nightmare. As I believe I mentioned in earlier videos, we're putting Harlan Sharp adjustable rockers on this. I do tend to see issues with these rockers not aligning with the tips of the valves correctly. These might be okay. I don't know. Hard to tell. We kind of need to do a pattern check, which is going to be tricky with these hydraulic lifters until they're pumped up. Anyway, because we're using an adjustable type rocker, we need a cup on the end of our push rod here. And because we're using a roller lifter, there's no factory push rod length that's going to work. So we have to custom measure this. To do this, I've got a 5/16 adjustable push rod here, again, with that cup on one end. We actually bought this to do the first big block I set up with a roller cam and these same exact aluminum heads and, well, not the same rockers actually. We used 440 source rockers on that one. We got one short enough to fit the low deck. Thankfully, there was enough thread in here to get out to the tall deck RB 440 size. I left the adjuster on this rocker as it shipped. That looks like a pretty good spot to be in. You can see we've just got a thread sticking out underneath there, so that's good. You can't fit 3/8 inch push rods in the 440 source heads without major grinding. We'll be sticking with the 5/16. As you can see, this 5/16 checking push rod is almost perfectly centered in the hole. I've only just noticed something which I do not love. These aftermarket aluminum heads are made in a different way than factory heads. The factory cast iron heads are just kind of open here and oil is able to drain back through that area. On these, it's basically a fully closed deck, so they just drilled holes, obviously for our push rods, and then for our oil drain back areas. Look at that though. It's half obscured by the head gasket and the deck surface. Yeah, there you go. There are 4 such holes, 1 at each end and 2 in the middle here, down there, and all of them are obscured in the same exact way. It's not that this is a huge deal or anything. We're definitely going to live with it. It just seems interesting. They had an opportunity here to put the hole somewhere that works, and they partially covered it. Obviously, when I checked this thing, I ensured that the lifter it was on the base circle. I spun this thing out so it just touched the ball adjuster on the rocker arm. If anything, I will fudge this a little bit shorter. It couldn't be any longer than it is, but a hair shorter would be fine because we can run those adjusters down, I'd say 1 to 2 threads with no issues. Now the measurement that you're going to want to take here is from the tip of this end, which is kind of mangled on here. Did I have to cut this down? Yeah, I guess I probably did. Anyway, the tip on this end to the socket on this end, the bottom of the socket. And so the right way to do that is take a 5/16 ball bearing, pop that in here, measure from the top of the ball bearing to the bottom of that tip, and then subtract the 5/16. Almost all pushrod companies measure the length that way. Edelbrock, for some reason, doesn't. They measure the overall length, the tip to this surface here. So if you're going to get Edelbrock pushrods, well, maybe just don't. But if you do, be aware of that. Obviously, to take that measurement, you're going to need some kind of tool that's long enough to do so. We don't have anything like that. As you can see, our crappy digital caliper here only goes to 6 inches, and this pushrod is going to be somewhere around 8. Because this is a Mopar and the adjustment is over the pushrod instead of in the middle like a Chevy, we can actually fudge this a little bit. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at it compared to a tape measure. You can see the bottom of that socket is like just over 8 inches. Yeah, I'm going to call that 8 1/16. Now, if we're going to err in either direction on this, it would have to be in a shorter direction, not a longer direction, because we need to have at least that 1 thread sticking out of our rocker. It's also possible that there will be variance from valve to valve here, and so we kind of want to account for that as well. I think what we'll probably do here is look for an 8-inch pushrod. That would give us that 16th and then some to adjust. You know, I was thinking 8 inches dead might be a common length for a pushrod. It's not. There are 7.97s, and then there are 8.103s. That's almost 1/8 of an inch. 0.103, 1/8 is 0.125, and I just think that's going to be too long. Well, I've decided I'm going to go with the 7.97-inch push rods. They are in stock at Summit Racing. They're the right diameter. They're made by Melling. They're $12 a piece, which I swear is a good bit more than push rods used to cost, but whatever. At least they're in stock, and we can just order them. So now we get to wait for push rods. And because we're waiting for push rods, there's not a whole lot I can do, really. I suppose I can at least make it look like an awesome high-performance 440, and then we can prematurely declare mission accomplished. First, I'm going to install our soup. I will be pouring an additional 5 quarts of break-in oil in here. In fact, maybe more like 6, but I'm not going to bother with that right at the moment. You see, I'm not going to final install the intake manifold until the push rods are in place. And I can't pre-lubricate the engine until the push rods are in place and the rocker arms are secured. I will drop a shiny new Felpro Valley Tray / intake manifold gasket in place. Not permanently, obviously. And there's our Edelbrock Performer RPM manifold dropped in place. Again, not permanently. Note, this thing looks a little funky. It was clear coated at some point, and there's some green staining here, which I'm pretty sure is from fluid dripping out of our AC compressor, which lives right here. Speaking of which, I'm faced with a bit of a quandary, because this thing is running some big crazy serpentine belt drive setup, and we're not going to be running that on our engine stand when we break this thing in. Well, and when I say break it in, it's a roller cam. We're just going to fire it up and run it for a little bit to make sure all the fluids stay in and it sounds good. Anyway, I don't want to put any of that on. We have a temporary V-belt setup we always use, but that mounts with special long bolts that go through this water pump housing, which means we don't have any factory hardware for this. I'll probably just have to scare some up. I'm not going to worry about any of that front dress stuff for now, but there are a couple more things I can do, like installing the fuel pump and the fuel pump push rod, for example. Someone in the comments of my Hemi assembly video a couple weeks back was very confused about how this works, so I want to explain that real fast. This is the fuel pump push rod. It gets installed through a threaded hole in the block and pushed up toward the camshaft. That hole looks like this. It's located directly below the mechanical fuel pump. The push rod is installed just like this. You then have to install a pipe plug here because that hole would be open into crankcase and would make a horrible oily mess. As you can see, the pushrod has a little guide boss thingy in here, and it's going to slide all the way up in there until it contacts its lobe on the camshaft. Now to get the pump in here, what you have to do is hold that all the way up in there while you slide the little tang down. Once the two pieces are mated together inside of the engine, they're going to look kind of like this. Now you can see how installing this pump would be difficult because when there's no tang here to hold it, this push rod just falls down and completely blocks your ability to install this pump. So typically you'll hold it up in there with a pick or a long screwdriver like this or something. You could also try using grease as lubricant instead of engine oil. That might have a little bit better hold. Might be able to keep it up in its boss there, but I don't know that that would actually work. I've always thought it might be clever to use a tool of some kind to push and hold the push rod through this hole, then install the pump, then install the threaded plug. However, remember at that time, there will be a whole mechanical fuel pump in the way, so that doesn't really work. All right, maybe it's possible. It just seems annoying. There, I've got the fuel pump push rod and the plug installed. You can see the push rod right here. Slides up when you hit it with a screwdriver, but it just falls right back down against the plug. Now, I think I've mentioned this entire engine was sandblasted. Word to the wise on that. Don't. That's why the pump looks like this, and our actual factory fuel pump bolts look like this. Kind of crusty and terrible. I'm just going to bolt this on to plug the hole for now. I grabbed that screwdriver. I lifted the push rod up. You can see this. It's sitting on top of the tang there for the fuel pump. You just kind of slide it in there underneath the rod, but make absolutely sure you're not trying to go on top of it. Now I can just lift it up, install the bolts, and we'll be good to go. Well, looky there. It's most of a 440. It's got valve covers loosely attached. Obviously all those other things I said. And I think we're done for now. It'll probably be another week until I'm back here with push rods in hand to finish putting the rockers and such together. And then we'll get this thing ready to break in on the Mopar or no cart. We're going to be running our 426 Hemi build before that though. Incidentally, that engine is also still waiting for push rods. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. It's not a secret at all. And you can tell just by looking at my channel. These bigger, higher performance engines never seem to garner the same sort of attention that a stock 318 garners. 273 and 318 LA engines, 225 slant 6s, and even polys, especially polys in fact, always get the big view numbers in these Engine Wednesdays. In spite of that, I'm going to keep building these engines, partially because, well, I get paid to do it, partially because horsepower can be fun at times, and also because in any project like this, there is always stuff to learn, always. And that goes for me and for you, the viewer. This spring and early summer saw us tearing down and diagnosing countless engines. Now, I really just need to rebuild all of these things. And so in the coming months, we're going to see a lot of that. We've got a 340, we've got a 273, we've got a 383 for a Barracuda, and the list goes on from there. Our 446 barrel engine for the 1970 Plymouth Sport Fury GT is done at the machine shop, so we're going to have to rebuild that thing as well. I'm looking forward to it. I don't know that we're going to see every one of these engine builds in detail, or in fact at all, on the channel. I do know that if I think there's something worth seeing, something that we can all learn from, well, I'm going to bring that to you, and hopefully you'll be here to watch it. Anyway, hopefully that was interesting or informative or something. In any case, as ever, I do thank you for watching. And remember, aftermarket means it'll fit after you mark it and cut it.